In 1832, a Jewish family fled persecution in Baghdad. They'd lost their fortune, barely escaped with their lives, and needed a place to rebuild. Of all the places in the world they could have gone, they chose India. Within just a few years, people were calling them the Rothschilds of the East. The Sassoon family became legendary for their generosity. They built schools, hospitals, libraries, and synagogues across India.
They funded infrastructure projects that transformed Bombay into one of Asia's greatest cities. The British Empire inducted them into nobility, a brown family given equal status in a racist colonial system. They became close companions of princes, married into the Rothschild dynasty, and accumulated wealth that rivaled Europe's greatest banking houses. But behind all this philanthropy, behind the hospitals and the schools and the glittering reputation, was a darker truth. The Sassoons made their fortune by destroying millions of lives. They built their empire on drugs, specifically opium. And they did it with the full support, protection, and encouragement of the British Empire. At their peak, the Sassoon family controlled roughly 70% of the world's opium trade. They flooded China with narcotics on an industrial scale, creating widespread addiction across Chinese coastal cities. Millions became dependent on a substance the Sassoons shipped by the ton. And as those millions suffered, the Sassoons grew unimaginably rich. This is the story of how a refugee family became drug kingpins with royal approval. How they weaponized charity to whitewash blood money. How they pioneered the modern playbook for using philanthropy to launder reputation. And how, despite building an empire on human misery, they were celebrated as heroes by the very society they served. Because the Sassoon story isn't just about one family. It's about how empires use intermediaries to do their dirty work. How money can buy not just power, but moral absolution. And how the systems that create this kind of wealth always collapse, not from external pressure, but from the rot within. Let's start with how they got there. Because the Sassoon rise to power began not with ambition, but with survival. Modern-day Mumbai stands among the richest cities in South Asia. Its economy produces over $300 billion in GDP annually, and many consider it India's financial, commercial, and entertainment hub. But if you dig into the history of India's richest city, one name keeps appearing: Sassoon. The family fled Baghdad in the 1820s and arrived in Bombay when it was still a British colonial port. They'd lost much of their wealth during the escape, but they still had access to something more valuable than money: global connections. Years of experience in Baghdad's government had given them networks that stretched across the Middle East, and they had a keen eye for opportunity. They quickly saw that Bombay was going to become a major trade hub, so they invested heavily in cotton mills. These mills became the engine of Bombay's prosperity well into the 20th century. The districts that hosted Sassoon mills later transformed into the center of India's new billionaire class. Today, those areas house luxury towers, malls, and office complexes that dominate the skyline. The Sassoons were also deeply involved in philanthropy. They endowed the city with schools, hospitals, synagogues, and libraries. Many of these institutions still function today, continuing to serve Mumbai's people. In many ways, Sassoon influence shaped not just the city's economy, but its civic and cultural life. But behind all this generosity was a desperate need to whitewash money. Because the biggest source of Sassoon income wasn't textile factories or real estate. It was drugs. The Sassoon family made their fortune smuggling opium into China. Opium was the most valuable narcotic in the world at that time, and British India cultivated it on a vast scale. The Sassoons came to dominate that trade. By some estimates, this family controlled 70% of the world's opium exports. And given that opium accounted for roughly 14% of Britain's overall income from India, the Sassoons got immensely rich. Profits from the drug trade
fueled their empire, and financed their investments in Bombay. Their wealth was so vast that the British inducted them into nobility, a brown family receiving rare privilege in what was essentially a racist empire. That's how powerful they were. But to understand how this happened, we need to go back to Baghdad, because the Sassoon story begins not with drugs, but with power, politics, and persecution. The Sassoon dynasty began in the late 1820s, with David Sassoon, the family's founding father, who had to flee Baghdad for his life. David was the son of Sheikh Sassoon ben Saleh, who served as chief treasurer in Baghdad's government. That position made the family influential, but it also put them at risk. When the city's notoriously greedy governor turned hostile, David was threatened and even held hostage. Fearing for his safety, David first escaped to Persia with his young family. The move offered temporary refuge, but he soon sought greater stability and better business opportunities. British India promised both. But there was a darker reason the British welcomed him. The British administration actively recruited Jewish minorities to work in the growing trade sector because there was no risk of them rebelling if they grew too rich. The Jewish population was so insignificant that the British never felt threatened. Some sources even suggest a British political agent encouraged the Sassoons to settle in British India. David's timing was perfect. Bombay was emerging as the commercial jewel of Western India. Cotton and opium formed the backbone of its prosperity, and the British were expanding the city's role as a global trading hub. David didn't arrive empty-handed. He brought his father's carefully cultivated network of merchant contacts stretching across the Middle East. These connections gave him unique access to markets, capital, and trust, at a time when such networks determined whether ventures succeeded or failed. But here's what's important. This wasn't an average merchant family. Back in Baghdad, they knew court politics. They understood how power worked. And from the moment David arrived in Bombay, he aligned himself completely with British imperial interests. His loyalty won him trust and protection under colonial rule, at a time when most Indian subjects were viewed with suspicion. David understood there was profit to be made within the empire's constraints, so he kept tabs on British conquests and wars, spreading his investments into new markets created by imperial expansion. But his family's biggest windfall came with the opening of China's massive domestic market. And to understand why, we need to talk about Britain's China problem. The British wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. China had zero interest in British goods. So, for the tea and silk they bought, the Chinese demanded payment in silver. Britain was hemorrhaging its silver reserves, and the trade imbalance became economically unsustainable. The Chinese Empire was accumulating silver, but buying nothing from Britain in return. From London's perspective, this was a crisis. They needed a product Chinese consumers would buy that could reverse the deficit. Their solution was opium. Britain flooded China with opium grown in India. Opium is highly addictive and destructive, a product Chinese consumers would pay for in silver. This reversed the trade deficit and extended British influence into Asia. And the Sassoons took full advantage. They became the dominant exporters of opium. The scale was vast. In 1836 alone, the Sassoon Company shipped over 30,000 chests of opium to China. Each chest weighed roughly 120 pounds. Just imagine the scale. This flooding of narcotics created widespread addiction in China's coastal cities. Millions of people became addicts to one of the most destructive substances ever created. But the Sassoons grew immensely rich, and with that wealth came influence. David Sassoon became a household name in Bombay. His family's philanthropy gave them prestige. Ordinary Indians didn't think much about how the family made money because all they could see were the good works: new schools, docks, libraries, hospitals being built. This earned the family great respect and admiration, and younger Sassoons carried the legacy even further, receiving honors directly from the Viceroy, the highest-ranking British official in India. Let me give you an example of their influence. The Sassoons created a system where Bombay's tramways issued special Sabbath passes so Jewish passengers could avoid handling money on Saturdays, in line with religious observance. That's how much power they wielded. But the Sassoon influence wasn't limited to India. Given their ties with the British administration and their vast wealth, they secured privileges in Britain itself. David set the precedent. In 1853, he was granted British citizenship in recognition of his services to the empire. Few colonial subjects achieved such status. It marked the family's entry into the inner circles of British power. Later generations went even further. They used opium fortunes to purchase stately homes across England. These estates allowed them to move in elite circles and cultivate ties with the royal family. Remember how people called the Sassoons the Rothschilds of the East? Well, the Sassoons started mingling with the actual Rothschilds. Their interests became uniquely intertwined. In 1859, the Sassoon family's Bombay home hosted a gathering of 500 guests. And this was deeply messed up. It was a celebration of Britain's decision to impose even more direct control over India. They were hosting a party celebrating their own people's subjugation. Events like this demonstrated how firmly the Sassoons had tied their fortunes to British imperial power. David's son, Reuben Sassoon, became a close companion of the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. The access to the heir of the throne was extraordinary for a family who'd been refugees just a generation earlier. Their prestige was enhanced by strategic marriages. Albert Sassoon's son married a Rothschild daughter, cementing ties between two Jewish dynasties integral to British imperial endeavors. The Rothschilds financed wars and conquests. The Sassoons supplied opium to offset Britain's trade deficits. Together, they were pillars of empire. But this constant attempt to be British led to an identity crisis. Many Sassoon descendants were embarrassed by reminders of their origins. They had relatives visiting from India, and the British-based Sassoons felt deeply uncomfortable and ashamed. Despite their fortunes and titles, they could never fully escape the tension between their Eastern roots and their aspirations to whiteness. How could they? Their entire success was tied to India and the opium trade, and their fortune was about to reach new heights. Britain's victory in the Opium Wars against China made it even easier to export Indian opium. Let me give you a quick refresher. There were two conflicts in the mid-19th century between China and Great Britain, fought over trade access and the legalization of opium. In the aftermath, Sassoon trade soared to almost 59,000 chests of opium. The Chinese market was wide open for a flood of narcotics. The wealth generated propelled the Sassoons to even higher circles. Albert Sassoon took over after David's death. In 1873, he received honorary freedom of the City of London, the first Jewish person ever awarded this distinction. Not even a Rothschild had received this recognition by that time. It symbolized just how important the Sassoon name had become among Britain's elite. Eventually, their reputation solidified outside the drug empire. They were savvy enough to invest in legitimate businesses. Starting with David, the family invested in property, insurance, and banking. These moves allowed them to survive downturns in the cotton market and financial crises that shook India. New ventures followed. The Sassoons invested in American railway syndicates, Hungarian national debt, and real estate across Europe. The family built a diversified global enterprise. But all of this was just a respectable front. Their core business remained drugs. The family fortune stayed tied to Indian opium exported to East Asia, continuing well into the 1920s, long after Britain and China had formally agreed to end the trade. The Sassoons adapted with technology. They embraced the telegraph to manage transactions across continents. They vertically integrated by buying steamships to transport opium, creating maritime insurance firms to protect vessels, and taking board seats at banks that financed the trade. They were present everywhere, from start to finish of their business model. Even as moral outrage against opium grew in Europe and India, the Sassoons didn't care. They were making too much money. Abdullah, also known as Albert Sassoon, even commissioned a family crest that proudly featured a poppy flower, the source of opium. For them, this was just business. Business they were proud of. But Albert might have thought the empire would last forever.
The next generation proved him wrong. After Albert's death, the family began to fracture. The next generation quarreled over money. Disputes grew so fierce that the family business split in two. On one side stood David Sassoon and Company, the original firm. On the other emerged E.B. Sassoon and Company, a breakaway venture led by another branch. Despite blood ties, these firms became bitter rivals. The rivalry turned especially vicious because both competed in the same trade, opium. Rather than uniting resources, they undercut each other, eroding the dominance the family once enjoyed. The generation after faced another problem: lack of interest. The London branch inherited control of David Sassoon and Co., but lacked the will to run it. For them, the firm was less a business and more a fountain of wealth. Most family members preferred extracting capital to fund lavish lifestyles, rather than doing the hard work of commerce. This detachment turned into disdain. Some descendants came to despise the very source of their fortune. One family member mocked their wealth as money made in the East by dirty trading. For a dynasty that once proudly featured poppies on its crest, such remarks showed how far they'd drifted from their origins. By 1939, the Sassoon family's direct involvement in David Sassoon & Co. ended altogether. The firm lingered under different management, but lost its stature. By the 1980s, it had declined so far that the British government declared two of its former partners totally unfit to serve as directors. Meanwhile, the other venture, E.D. Sassoon, went down a completely different path under Victor Sassoon. Victor tried to save the company by relocating to Shanghai, China's bustling commercial capital. To fund the move, he sold off Indian mills and assets, often at depressed prices. Victor feared the rise of the Indian National Congress and predicted instability if it came to power. In Shanghai, his gamble seemed to pay off, at least initially. By the mid-1930s, Fortune magazine hailed him as Shanghai's #1 realtor. His properties were worth the equivalent of $1.2 to $1.5 billion today. The relocation had an unexpected humanitarian impact. By 1939, Shanghai became one of the few places where Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution could enter without visas. More than 20,000 refugees arrived, many with nothing. They were welcomed by Shanghai's Baghdadi Jewish community, of which Victor Sassoon was the most prominent member. But these would be the final glory years. China soon brought sweeping nationalization. The Sassoon Empire in Shanghai was seized, assets worth over $1 billion in today's money. Victor's bold relocation proved to be his greatest mistake. The fall of Shanghai marked the end of the Sassoon business as a global force. Officially, their empire was over. Unofficially, some claim the Sassoons never really disappeared. Rather, they simply grew better at keeping their fortunes hidden. Money hides all sins, and nowhere is this more visible than in the Sassoon story. A family that began as exiles from Baghdad became the Rothschilds of the East. They took advantage of British imperialist wars and built empires from narcotics that destroyed millions of lives. Sure, they had prestige, they were active in philanthropy, but in the end, their own decisions and internal breakdowns ended their empire, leaving them fading into obscurity. Some say this is exactly what they wanted. Because fortunes like theirs rarely disappear. Instead, they dissolve, reappear, and resurface under different names. The Sassoon story teaches us something crucial about how power and wealth actually work. It's not just about accumulation. It's about laundering reputation. The Sassoons understood that if you build enough hospitals, fund enough schools, donate to enough causes, people stop asking where the money came from. This is the playbook that every controversial fortune since has followed. Tech billionaires funding climate initiatives while exploiting labor. Oil companies sponsoring environmental research. Pharmaceutical dynasties endowing universities while profiting from addiction. The Sassoons pioneered this model. They proved you could make money from human misery and still be celebrated as benefactors if you gave enough back. Not to the people you harmed,
to the people whose opinion mattered. They never built hospitals in China where millions suffered from the opium they shipped. They built them in Bombay, where British officials and Indian elites could see their generosity. The system worked perfectly until it didn't. Because empires built on extraction always collapse.
Not from external pressure, but from internal rot. The Sassoons fought among themselves, lost interest in the work, and squandered what their predecessors built. But the model they created, using philanthropy to whitewash exploitation, that model thrives. It's more sophisticated now, hidden behind corporate structures and foundation grants, but the principle remains the same. If you want to profit from harm, just make sure you're generous to the people who write history.
Because they're the ones who decide whether you're remembered as a hero or a villain.
The Sassoons chose hero, and for over a century it worked. History has the answers. We just have to decide whether we're willing to see past the hospitals and schools to the millions who suffered so they could be built.